Ethan Monroe had always been more than just a painter. He was a magician of light, a weaver of color, and a storyteller in every brushstroke. His works were sought after by collectors worldwide, each painting pulsing with vibrant energy, capturing emotions and fleeting moments in ways words could never express. But what truly set him apart was his unparalleled eye for detail, his ability to see the world in hues and contrasts that most people missed. Then it happened. At first, it was nothing but a faint blurriness on the edges of his vision, a little trick his eyes seemed to play on him whenever he worked late into the night. He shrugged it off, thinking it was fatigue or perhaps the strain from poring over intricate details under a harsh studio light. But the haziness didn't disappear. Instead, it crept into his life slowly, like an unwelcome guest lingering in the background. It became harder to focus on the fine lines, the tiny strokes that brought his paintings to life. Ethan visited an ophthalmologist one afternoon, more out of curiosity than concern. But as the doctor examined him, a strange, somber look crossed his face. Ethan's heart thudded heavily as he waited for the doctor to speak. "Ethan," the doctor began, his voice soft, cautious, "it's a rare condition, degenerative retinal disease. It's going to progress slowly, but there's no treatment. Your vision will keep fading until, eventually, you won't be able to see." The words felt like thick paint splashed across his life, darkening everything in an instant. For a moment, he simply sat there, numb, the enormity of the diagnosis sinking in like a cold stone in his chest. How could this be? The hands that had danced over canvas for decades now trembled, and his heart raced with fear and confusion. Days blurred together after that appointment. Ethan shut himself in his studio, his sanctuary, surrounded by paintings that felt like distant memories of a life that was slipping through his fingers. Shadows thickened around him, both literal and emotional, as he struggled to grasp the reality of his new world. Each day he awoke hoping the diagnosis had been a nightmare, but every attempt to paint reminded him of the slow march of darkness. As his vision dulled, his fears sharpened. He found himself staring at a blank canvas, brush in hand, unable to paint a single stroke. He could still remember every color, every technique, yet the thought of painting without seeing seemed like an impossible dream, one as distant as the memories of his perfect, vibrant vision. And so, the question began to haunt him. How could he continue creating when he could no longer see? The silence in the studio offered no answer. For the first time in his life, Ethan Monroe, the celebrated painter, felt powerless, caught in a world that was slowly abandoning him to shadows. Ethan had always believed that every artist leaves a part of their soul in each piece they create. Now, with his world closing in, he was determined to leave a final masterpiece. A painting that would capture everything he'd ever wanted to say, everything he'd ever felt. It would be his farewell to the world of light and color, a lasting impression before the darkness claimed him completely. He began his work under the warm glow of the studio lights, trying to savor every brushstroke, each movement feeling sacred, intentional. The painting he envisioned was grand, a scene of dawn breaking over an endless ocean, light spilling over the waves in cascading shades of blue and gold. It was, to him, the embodiment of hope, the reminder that every night eventually finds its dawn. But the brush didn't glide as smoothly as before. His eyes strained, struggling to catch the details. The sunlight in the painting, once vibrant in his mind, now seemed muted, the golden hues less distinct, blurring at the edges. Frustration clawed at him, a deep anger he had never felt before, and he set the brush down with a heavy sigh. It was as if his own hands were betraying him, unable to bring forth the colors that once flowed effortlessly from his imagination. Hours turned to days as Ethan wrestled with the canvas, each session leaving him feeling more depleted, his vision fading just a bit more each time. He worked late into the night, leaning close to the canvas, painting furiously, trying to capture every last detail before it was too late. The process felt like a race against time, each brushstroke more frantic than the last, and he lost himself in the fury of creation, willing his hands to remember what his eyes no longer could. But the painting wasn't coming together. The colors seemed off, the textures felt wrong, and the scene he'd envisioned appeared foreign, almost haunting in its half-formed state. He knew that, with his vision dimming faster than he'd anticipated, he might never see the painting completed as he had imagined it. For an artist who had once created with ease, this struggle felt like a cruel joke, a relentless reminder of what he was losing. Desperation grew in his chest like a storm. He had spent his life creating beauty, and now, with all his skill and passion, he couldn't bring forth the one image he most wanted to leave behind. His brush fell from his hand, clattering to the floor, and he leaned against the canvas, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers, a tactile reminder of the world he was losing. Defeated, Ethan sat in silence, his masterpiece incomplete before him. The darkness seemed to press in closer, not only in his eyes but in his heart. He wondered if this would be the end of his art, of his purpose. With a broken spirit, he left the studio that night, thinking perhaps he'd been right to believe his journey as an artist was coming to a close. Yet, even as he closed the door, a small flicker of hope lingered, fragile but undeniable. Ethan couldn't fully abandon the art that had been his life. Somewhere deep inside, he felt that there was still a way forward, a path he had yet to discover, if only he could find the courage to walk it. Days turned into weeks, and the final, incomplete canvas lay untouched in the studio, a silent testament to Ethan's despair. He withdrew from friends, ignored calls, and closed himself off from the world, letting the silence grow heavy around him. It felt as though the light that had once filled his life was slipping further out of reach, leaving only emptiness in its place. One evening, Ethan took an aimless walk through the city, his dark glasses shielding what little sight remained. He found himself wandering into a small park where street performers gathered. Normally, he would have passed by without a second thought, but a haunting melody caught his ear, pulling him closer. The music was bold yet delicate, each note brimming with an energy that seemed to paint colors in the air. Sitting alone with her violin was a young woman, her eyes closed, a look of pure concentration on her face as she played. Ethan watched her, transfixed, sensing that she was seeing something beyond the visual. The sounds she coaxed from her violin seemed almost tangible, vibrant hues brought to life through melody. It reminded him of the way he once poured color into his art, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of curiosity stir within him. When she finished, the woman opened her eyes and, sensing his presence, smiled in his direction. Ethan hesitated but approached her, drawn by an inexplicable pull. "Your music. It was beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you," she replied, her gaze unfocused, drifting past him in a way that felt strangely familiar. "I'm glad you could see it." She paused, her face lighting up in recognition of her own words. "Or rather, hear it." Ethan blinked. "See it? Through sound." She nodded. "Yes, I'm blind, but I've learned to interpret the world around me differently. I imagine each note as a color or a texture. When I play, it feels like painting a picture in my mind, one that others can experience with me." Her words settled over him like a revelation. She couldn't see, yet she was still creating, still experiencing the world with a richness he hadn't thought possible. Ethan felt his heart beat faster, the weight of his despair lifting ever so slightly. Was there truly a way to create, even without sight? The young woman introduced herself as Mira, and as they spoke, Ethan found himself telling her his story, his fear that he'd lost his ability to create forever. Mira listened patiently, her expression one of deep empathy. When he finished, she smiled gently and placed a hand on his. "Ethan, sight is just one way of experiencing the world," she said softly. "Close your eyes and listen, really listen, to the world around you. You'll find it's filled with so much that words can't describe, things you might never have noticed before. Art is about expression, not just sight. Maybe there's a way to create that you haven't discovered yet." Ethan left that evening with her words echoing in his mind. Back in his studio, he sat in silence, letting her advice sink in. Slowly, he closed his eyes and began to listen. The faint hum of the city outside his window, the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall, the subtle creak of his chair beneath him. All these sounds painted an invisible world around him, alive and textured. For the first time since his diagnosis, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe there was a way to transform the sounds, textures, and sensations he experienced into something new, something that didn't rely on sight but on an entirely different form of vision. The canvas he had abandoned remained in the corner, untouched, but now, it felt less like a failure and more like a blank slate, a space waiting for him to explore the colors hidden in sound and touch. It was as if, in meeting Mira, he had been given a new set of tools, a new language to express the beauty still within him. Ethan resolved to try. He wasn't sure how or where it would lead, but he knew that this was only the beginning of a different kind of journey. And, for the first time since the darkness had crept into his life, he was ready to embrace it. In the days that followed, Ethan ventured into his studio with a renewed sense of purpose, though it was tinged with uncertainty. He spent hours experimenting, letting go of the instinct to rely on sight and embracing the idea of touch and sound as his new guides. His hands moved over different textures, searching for a way to translate the world he felt into a physical form. He began experimenting with unconventional materials. Thick, textured paints, coarse sand mixed into the paint, raised lines that would mark boundaries on the canvas. Each element felt strange yet exhilarating, like discovering a new language in which he only knew a few words. His hands traced the contours he created, feeling the rise and fall of the paint beneath his fingers, trying to imagine the picture his hands were shaping in place of his eyes. At first, his attempts felt chaotic, even frustrating. The early pieces were muddled, uncertain compositions of rough lines and misplaced strokes. Ethan was used to finesse, to a delicate touch that relied on his keen sight, and now he was learning to create in a way that felt almost primitive. Yet, with each stroke, he felt himself letting go of the need for perfection. His art was taking on a new life, one shaped by instinct rather than precision. One evening, Mira visited his studio, intrigued to see what he had been working on since their first conversation. Ethan felt a wave of vulnerability as he showed her the rough, tactile paintings scattered around the room. The pieces were nothing like his previous work. They lacked the crisp details, the vibrant colors he was known for. But Mira walked up to one of the canvases, ran her hands over it, and smiled. "Ethan, this is beautiful," she murmured, her fingers tracing the patterns he had created. "I can feel the depth, the texture. It's as if I'm touching the very emotions you poured into this." Her reaction lifted his spirits, and something clicked within him. Art wasn't just about capturing a perfect image. It was about capturing feeling, a presence, a moment. Through touch, Mira was able to experience his work, understanding it in a way that transcended sight. With newfound determination, Ethan refined his techniques. He painted with his eyes closed, focusing entirely on how the brush felt in his hand, the textures he could feel beneath his fingers. He experimented with layering paint to create depth, using his fingers directly on the canvas to feel the weight and direction of each stroke. He even added materials like stones, fabric, and wire, incorporating elements that would bring the art to life through touch alone. One piece he worked on obsessively was a depiction of the ocean, a vast, sweeping scene reminiscent of his last vision for the final canvas he'd abandoned. But this time, he didn't paint waves with delicate colors or brushstrokes. Instead, he textured the canvas with waves he could feel, creating a pattern of rising and falling ridges that mirrored the sensation of the sea's rolling movement. He invited Mira back once it was finished, her hands moving over the waves he had sculpted with paint and texture. As she explored the piece, her face lit up with recognition and awe, and she described the feelings it evoked in her. The endlessness of the ocean, the coolness of the water, and the warmth of sunlight breaking over the waves. Ethan realized then that his art was taking on a new dimension, one that allowed others to feel his work in ways they might not have before. In that moment, he understood that he was creating not despite his blindness, but because of it. The limitations he feared were becoming the very source of his innovation, urging him to find ways of sharing his world with others beyond the confines of sight. For Ethan, each piece became a journey, not just for him as an artist, but for those who experienced his work through their own senses, bringing his art to life in ways he hadn't imagined. Ethan's hands, now calloused and paint-stained, held the memories of each piece he crafted, and he felt, for the first time since the darkness had crept into his world, that he was beginning to see again. Only this time he was seeing through his hands, his heart, and the touch of those who experienced his art. Ethan's journey into the tactile world of art began to attract attention beyond his close circle. Word spread around the community about the blind painter who had redefined his craft. People were drawn to his story, curious to see how an artist could create masterpieces without sight. His studio, once a solitary space, became a place of gathering, filled with the hum of voices and the soft sounds of hands gliding over textured canvases. One day, a local gallery owner approached Ethan with an idea. "What if we host a workshop?" she suggested, excitement shining in her eyes. "You could share your technique, teach others to see as you do, through touch and emotion. I think people would find it transformative." The idea unsettled him at first. He had only recently begun to accept this new way of creating, and the thought of teaching it to others felt daunting. But something deeper compelled him to accept. Ethan knew he had stumbled upon something powerful, a way of connecting to others that went beyond visual beauty, reaching into the very core of feeling and human connection. Maybe sharing that with others was exactly what he needed. On the day of the workshop, the studio was full of people of all ages, from children to elderly visitors, all eager to understand how to create without sight. Ethan could feel their curiosity and anticipation, and he realized that many of them were there not just to learn a new technique, but to experience art in a deeply personal way. Ethan guided them through simple exercises at first. He asked each participant to close their eyes, hold a brush, and feel the canvas beneath their hands. He encouraged them to think of a memory, a feeling, something powerful that they wished to convey. With eyes closed, they began painting, hesitant at first, but growing bolder with each stroke. He taught them to mix sand, fabric, and other textured materials into their paint, letting each person create shapes and contours they could feel with their fingers. As they worked, Ethan moved through the group, offering gentle encouragement and advice, marveling at the beauty in their expressions. For many, the experience was liberating, a release of their fears and hesitations as they created without the judgment of sight. One older woman, her hands trembling, had painted a small canvas filled with raised, swirling shapes. "This reminds me of the garden I had when I was young," she said, her voice quivering. "The way the flowers brushed my skin, the roughness of the earth. It's as if I can feel it again." Her eyes shone with tears, and she squeezed Ethan's hand in gratitude. For Ethan, each story, each canvas filled with emotion, became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He realized that his art was no longer just about him. It had grown into something greater, something that belonged to everyone who experienced it. He was guiding others to connect with their memories and senses, to translate their own lives onto a blank surface without worrying about how it looked but focusing on how it felt. As the workshop continued, the once silent studio was filled with laughter, tears, and even applause. By the end of the day, the walls were covered in their works, each canvas a unique story told through touch, each one an individual journey that reflected joy, pain, longing, and hope. Ethan walked among the pieces, running his fingers over the textured surfaces, feeling the powerful, collective soul of the group. The gallery owner, moved by the outcome, asked if she could showcase these works alongside Ethan's in an upcoming exhibition. Ethan agreed, knowing that his journey had become entwined with the journeys of others. His heart swelled with a profound sense of purpose, realizing that his art was reaching people not just visually, but on a deeply emotional level, touching their lives in ways that only connection and vulnerability could achieve. For the first time, Ethan felt that his work was a true reflection of his soul, no longer limited to what the eye could see but reaching into the unseen places of the heart. In this new world of texture, touch, and shared emotion, he discovered that his art was a canvas of the soul, a medium that defied darkness and brought light to those who experienced it with him. The gallery was buzzing with anticipation on the night of Ethan's exhibition, now transformed into an experience that welcomed everyone, including those who had never stepped foot into an art gallery before. News of Ethan's tactile approach to painting had sparked widespread interest, and the exhibition had been set up to allow visitors to touch each piece, to feel the textures, contours, and emotions embedded within the artwork. The gallery owner had gone one step further, designing the space with soft lighting to encourage people to rely on their other senses, inviting them to step into Ethan's world. Ethan stood by the entrance, listening to the low hum of voices and the sounds of people exploring his work. He felt a strange mix of excitement and vulnerability. This was his first time displaying art created without his sight, and each piece on display held pieces of his journey, the pain, and discovery he had experienced. The walls were lined not only with his paintings, but also with the works from his workshop students, who had poured their own stories and memories into each canvas. As guests wandered through, he could hear their reactions, surprised gasps and murmurs of appreciation. People brushed their fingers across the pieces, pausing to absorb the textures and forms, allowing the art to evoke feelings rather than relying solely on the visual impact. It was an entirely different kind of engagement, an immersive experience that gave viewers a chance to step into the heart of each piece and explore it on a profoundly personal level. One young girl with her eyes closed traced her fingers over Ethan's ocean painting, feeling the ebb and flow of the textured waves he had crafted to mimic the motion of the sea. "It feels like the water is moving," she whispered to her mother, a soft awe in her voice. Her mother, wiping away a tear, thanked Ethan, telling him how this experience had changed the way her daughter connected with art. Others, too, approached him throughout the evening, sharing their stories and interpretations. A man who had once been a sculptor but had lost his sense of touch due to an accident lingered over a piece that Ethan had created to resemble a mountain range. With eyes closed, he moved his hands over the rough peaks and valleys, lost in a reverie that Ethan could feel as deeply as if it were his own. Each interaction felt like an affirmation that his art had found a new purpose. Ethan realized that his work was not just a personal journey but a bridge for others to discover new ways of connecting, of feeling the world without the limitations of sight. These moments brought his heart a quiet, intense joy, a reminder that his art had not been lost but reborn. The centerpiece of the exhibition, however, was a new painting Ethan had created just for this night. A sprawling abstract landscape that spanned the entire back wall, filled with textured hills, valleys, and swirls that represented his emotional landscape since his diagnosis. Each rise and fall was a memory, each texture a story from his journey. People gathered around it, hands moving slowly across the rough, layered surface as they explored the intricate emotions woven into the piece. As the evening went on, a blind woman approached him, guided by her husband. She introduced herself as Anna and explained that she had come specifically because she had heard about his work from Mira. Ethan felt a deep connection to her as she moved to the wall-sized painting, her hands tracing the landscape, feeling the layers of his journey. "This is incredible, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I can feel everything you put into this, every struggle, every bit of hope. It's like seeing a painting for the first time." Tears filled her eyes, and she hugged him, a gesture that spoke of a bond beyond words. Toward the end of the night, Ethan stood before the piece himself, his own hands tracing the contours of his work, feeling each texture, each shape. The gallery owner approached him with a quiet smile. "You've changed this place tonight, Ethan. People are talking about accessibility, about different ways to create, to feel. You've opened their eyes, but in a way none of us expected." Ethan felt a wave of gratitude, realizing that his journey had come full circle. His art was no longer bound by vision but existed in the realm of touch, sound, and emotion. In embracing his limitations, he had unlocked a new world for himself and for others, one that transcended sight and became an experience of connection, empathy, and shared humanity. That night, as the last guests left and the gallery fell silent, Ethan touched the final canvas once more, feeling the rough peaks and gentle slopes of his story beneath his fingers. He no longer feared the darkness. Instead, he felt a sense of peace, knowing he had found colors in the dark, a world where his art would continue to live, seen not with the eyes but with the heart. In the weeks following the exhibition, Ethan's life shifted in unexpected ways. Letters began arriving from people all over the world, some from fellow artists who had experienced loss, others from people who had never before felt connected to art. Each message spoke of how his work had touched them, resonating in ways they'd never expected. His story and his art had sparked a movement, a renewed interest in art that embraced all senses, an experience that allowed everyone, regardless of their abilities, to connect deeply and personally. Ethan's studio transformed into a lively hub, filled with people from all walks of life, some young, some old, some sighted, others blind, all drawn by a desire to create beyond the visual. He held regular workshops, teaching his techniques and encouraging his students to explore their own emotions through touch and texture. Each workshop became a new journey, as people learned to translate their memories, dreams, and feelings onto the canvas in ways they hadn't thought possible. One day, a woman from a nonprofit for disabled artists reached out to him with a proposal to start a program that would make art accessible to those with visual impairments and other disabilities. She envisioned a traveling exhibition of his tactile art, one that would visit schools, community centers, and institutions, inviting people to experience art through touch. Ethan agreed wholeheartedly, feeling a renewed purpose unfolding before him. The program would be a way to share what he had learned, to help others find beauty in unexpected places, just as he had. As the program took shape, Ethan found himself traveling, speaking to crowds, sharing his story with people who were eager to learn how he had transformed his loss into a new way of seeing. He visited schools for the visually impaired, watching as children eagerly traced their fingers over textured canvases, their faces lighting up with wonder and understanding. For many, it was the first time they had truly felt art in a way that was personal, tangible, and real. One young boy named Sam, who had been born blind, touched one of Ethan's textured landscapes and turned to him, a look of pure joy on his face. "I can feel the mountains," he said, his fingers moving over the raised lines and grooves Ethan had sculpted. "I can imagine what they must be like." In that moment, Ethan realized that his art had given others the gift of imagining, of traveling to places they'd never seen but could feel, just as he had learned to do. The exhibition continued to gain momentum, and as it grew, so did Ethan's understanding of his role as an artist. He was no longer creating only for himself but had become a guide, a mentor, someone who showed others how to express themselves, to feel deeply, to see with their hearts. He had become an artist not of sight, but of emotion, a painter of unseen worlds. Years passed, and Ethan continued his work, now surrounded by a community he had helped build, a group of artists who created with their hands, hearts, and memories. His once solitary studio was now filled with students and visitors, people who had found in Ethan's art a place where they could be free, where they could create without limits. One day, while sitting quietly in his studio after a long workshop, Ethan picked up a brush and ran his fingers over the bristles, feeling the familiar texture, the weight of it in his hand. He smiled, thinking back to the first time he had held a brush after his diagnosis, filled with fear and uncertainty. That fear had long faded, replaced by a profound sense of peace. His journey had been painful, yes, but it had led him to a place he never would have discovered otherwise. Ethan knew he had found his true calling, not just as a painter, but as someone who had learned to see beyond vision. He understood that art was never about perfection or the approval of others. It was about connection, about bringing people together to feel, to imagine, to remember. In sharing his story, he had created a legacy that would live on in each person he had touched, each hand that had traced his work, each heart that had found solace and beauty in his journey. As Ethan closed his eyes, he felt the familiar shapes of his latest canvas beneath his fingers, the textures and contours now as vivid to him as any color he had once seen. He knew that he had, at last, painted the world he had always dreamed of, not in strokes of light, but in touches of hope, resilience, and boundless imagination. And in that world, he would continue to live on, inspiring others to see beyond what was visible, to discover that art and life itself was something they could feel with every part of their soul. Thank you for spending your time with us. If the story touched you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Let's embrace the journey together.